to make sure that the UK is not a bystander when it comes to global violence against girls, and particularly, what are we doing about the proscription of the IRGC in Iran?
Minister.
Of course, the Right Honourable Lady knows that this is the province of the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. They lead the government's support for human rights, but also particularly for matters pertaining to women. This government, however, working with the Home Office, the FCDO, do a lot of work to promote women's rights. It's really important that the political systems in other countries are able to protect those rights. And the main thing we do is sanctions. Sanctions are very important in this area. They send a clear message to all sorts of political organisations across the world, including the Iranian authorities. They will be held to account for the repression of women abroad.
Yeah. Minister Yasmin Qureshi.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, nearly 5,000 cases of spiking incidents were reported to the police in England and Wales. But this figure is likely to be much higher. Spiking is endemic in our nighttime economy. Women and girls should be able to go about their business and enjoy nights out without fear. While the government pays lip service, cases across the country are rising. Yet we have no actual reporting system for this heinous crime. When will the Minister do the right thing by victims and make spiking a separate criminal offence?
The government is looking very carefully and speaking to stakeholders about spiking. It's quite clear that there are, at the moment, adequate criminal offences for this sort of behaviour, and there are quite high-profile convictions that we get. However, the Honourable Lady is quite right to highlight this, and the government will look at it and review it. There are specific funds that have been given. There are better testing. Evidence is really, really important. But what we need to do is to get women and boys to come forward when they have been spiked. And it also affects older people. I read a case the other day where there was somebody in his 40s who was spiked. So it's absolutely essential that we work in this area.
Dr. Rupahat.
Mr. Speaker.
Who's answering? Two? Who's doing it?
Yeah, OK. I took my glasses off. That's always a problem, isn't it? The case review made for very sobering reading around the allegations of racism, misogyny and homophobia in the Met. They are deeply disturbing. The Home Secretary and the Prime Minister have been very clear that urgent improvements must be delivered. We will have confidence, I have confidence that the Met Commissioner is leading in this area. I've also met Dame Lynn Owens, and she's doing great work in this area. We want to see improvement, and we must have it.
With the Police Federation now accepting institutional racism, plus the vile sexism detailed by Casey, and damning fire brigade reports, will the government now order an urgent inquiry into cultures among uniformed officers to keep both workplaces and the public safe?
Yeah. Minister.
Workplaces and the public must be safe, but I do have confidence that work is now going on, particularly in the Met, but across the whole country. Racism will not be accepted, particularly in the Met. Unfortunately, the Mayor has got his eye off the ball in that. Under him, crime, including issues of racism, rose by 10%. Labour are actually weak on crime. It is this government that is holding the Met to account.
Patricia Gibson.
Mr. Speaker.
You stay.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 3 and 12 together. The gender pay gap has fallen by approximately a quarter in the last decade. The Conservative government introduced gender pay gap reporting, building on the pay protections we already have in the Equality Act, and this has motivated employers to look at their pay data and improve workplace gender equality.
Patricia Gibson.
Mr. Speaker, the gender pay gap feeds the pension gap, which impacts on a large proportion of the women in the UK. The government doesn't even have a suitable definition for the gender pension gap. As a campaigner on this issue for many years, does the Minister agree with me that delays in reducing the gender pension gap are simply unacceptable? And can she tell me what representations she has made to her colleagues in the DWP to urgently address this?
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, the gender pensions gap, as the Honourable Lady describes it, is a complex issue. It is tied to the labour market, the pension system and demographic differences. But what we've been doing means that by 2030, over 3 million women will have benefited from a higher state pension due to the new state pension reforms. On average, female pensioners will receive around £570 a year more than they would have received under the previous system. And that is the work that we're doing to address this issue.
Adam Kaiser.
Mr. Speaker, Boston Society evidence shows that over 1/3 of women want to work but are prevented by reasons including a lack of flexible working options and affordable childcare. The UK Government's proposed reforms to their consultation still requires employees to request flexible working. Will the Minister ensure that this is provided as a day-one right to support women to remain in work and to help tackle the gender pay gap?
Here, here.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady will know that we are supporting the Employment Relations Flexible Working Private Members Bill, which will deliver changes including that employers will be required to consult with an employee as a means of exploring alternative options before rejecting a request for a flexible working, and employees will be enabled to make 2 flexible working requests a year, up from 1, and will receive faster decisions on their requests. Employees will no longer be required to explain the impact of their requested arrangement on the employer, and we think that that will go a long way to resolve the issues around flexible working.
Joe Gideon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Campaigners are highlighting the twin impacts of the gender pay gap and the cost of living crisis on women. What support is my right honourable friend giving to women who are struggling financially?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. She will know that the support we provide is based on need, not by protected characteristic. So the decisive action we have taken has been to support households across the UK whilst remaining fiscally responsible. We are delivering the largest ever increase in the national living wage, benefiting over 2 million people, and that is disproportionately women. And we're also prioritising support for the most vulnerable families, increasing benefits in line with inflation. And that means more than 10 million working age families will see an increase in their benefit payments.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Kirsten Oswald.
Mr. Speaker, according to the Fawcett Society, the UK Government lags behind other European countries in making companies act to close the gender pay gap, and it has failed to introduce mandatory reporting of pay differences based on ethnicity. So if the UK Government is serious about driving down pay inequality, why won't they require employers to set out action plans to improve gender equality? And why won't they mandate intersectional ethnicity pay gap reporting? And if they're not serious and they continue to refuse to act, will they devolve employment law to Scotland so that we can do it ourselves?
Mr. Speaker, on the issue of mandatory ethnicity reporting, I have said it in almost every equalities rules. I'm prepared to say it again. It is not the appropriate tool. Ethnicity pay gap reporting cannot be compared to gender pay gap reporting. Gender pay gap reporting is binary. Ethnicity pay gap reporting goes across at least 19 groups. It is dependent on geography, among other things, as well as representation within the workforce. We need to do what we can to make sure that employers do the right thing. But these sorts of interventionist policies that the Honourable Lady is raising are not helpful, and they actually make things worse, obscure the data, and do absolutely nothing, as she's describing, in order to address issues around ethnicity pay gap reporting.
Angela Richardson.
4, please, sir.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Equality Act of 2010 covers a number of protected characteristics, including age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnerships, race, religion and belief, sex and sexual orientation. And my right honourable friend has written to the EHRC to understand if the Act sufficiently is clear in the balance it strikes between the interests of people with those different characteristics.
Richards.
Thank the Minister for his answer. What assessment has he made on the importance of protecting single-sex spaces?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for her question, and we are committed to maintaining the safeguard that allows organisations to provide single-sex spaces. It is important that the principle of being able to operate spaces is reserved for women and girls. The Government is committed to tackling harassment and abusive behaviour by all individuals and ensuring that single-sex spaces are safe. EHRC has published guidance on the legislation and the clarity that is there to help those that are providing those spaces, and this does not change the legal position or the law.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just this week, the Government stated that it agreed with the Law Commission's recommendations in its review of hate crime laws that there should not be additional protected characteristics of sex and gender. Can the Minister explain what the implications are for this of moves towards making misogyny a hate crime, of violence towards women and girls, and can he assure us that there's not any intention to address protected characteristics in the Equality Act?
Well, I think over the last few years there have been at least, I think, 15 calls for various extra characteristics to be added. There hasn't been sufficient evidence to do that. We will always keep those under review, but let me make it very clear that this government will absolutely do everything it can to tackle any issues around violence towards women and girls. We have been strong on our actions on those that seek to create harm and will continue to do so.
Richard Ford.
5, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Equality Act of 2010 places a duty on businesses and service providers to make reasonable adjustments to improve disabled people's access to the goods and services that they provide. It is absolutely imperative that they are not placed in a substantial disadvantage compared to those who are non-disabled.
Richard Ford.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Maggie from my part of East Devon is one of 11 million people in this country who has hearing loss. Maggie went to a well-known high street branch and explained that because of her hearing, she's unable to use the phone, and she was offered a 50-mile round trip to Exeter instead. So, in pursuit of the Equalities Act, can the Minister explain what the government is doing to ensure banks and big businesses make reasonable adjustments for those with hearing loss?
Minister.
Well, I'm sorry to hear of the example that the honourable gentleman has made about his constituent, and under the Equality Act it would be indirect discrimination if a service provider puts place rules or procedures which apply in the same way for everyone but have a disproportionate adverse effect on particular groups. I'd be more than happy to meet with him to discuss the particular issue and see if further action can be devised for his constituent.
Sir Oliver Hill.
My Rise and Wall friend agree with me that this goes hand in hand with access to work. And does he agree with me that it is important that those who assess for grants for access to work shouldn't be too much the generalist, and that they should have specific knowledge of the sort of conditions of the person concerned? And I'd be interested to know if he has any plans to explain how this might be improved, because I have had one or two complaints.
Minister.
So I can say to my right honourable friend that the Disability Minister is actually looking at this as we speak, seeking to see how this can be streamlined. I'll be more than happy to update him with further details.
Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will take questions 6 and 9 together. It is this government that has recognised that maternal disparities do exist for Black, Asian and minority ethnic women and those from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. That is why in February last year we set up the Maternity Disparities Task Force to tackle these disparities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister agree with me that we owe a huge thanks to the member for Streatham for her work as the chair of the APPG on black maternal health? And secondly, black women are 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy and childbirth and 43% more likely to miscarry. The Select Committee report highlighted the government is failing to act, with the Maternity Disparities Task Force ironically meeting every 9 months instead of every 2. Will the Minister commit today to set binding targets and properly resource solutions to end this scandal and these disparities?
Minister.
Well, I'm very happy to place on record my thanks to the Honourable Member for Streatham. She does a fantastic work in this place. Can I just point out that the figures are lower than that? It's now 3.5 times for black women compared to white women. It's still too high, and that's why we're doing record amounts of work in this space. Only last month, the NHS published the 3-year single delivery plan for maternity and neonatal services, which will end disparities, or trying to end disparities in pregnancy and childbirth. And it's why the task force itself is looking at preconception care, where many of the disparities are embedded years before a woman gets pregnant.
Ellen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whether it's 3.5 times more likely
that black women die in childbirth, or 4 times more likely. It is a shameful and inexcusable reality that is the case in our country. The Women and Equality Select Committee was absolutely clear about the government's own failings in this area. It criticised a lack of accurate data, a lack of funding for maternity services, a lack of consistency of care across the country, a lack of representation of black women on the Maternal Disparities Task Force, and the downplaying of the role of racism in this issue. When is the government going to get a grip on this disgraceful injustice with the urgency that it demands?
Can I say that to say that the Maternity Disparities Task Force doesn't represent black women, when the co-chair is Professor Jacqueline Dunkley-Bent, one of the renowned lead midwives in the world, a black woman herself who is leading this work, she has been driving forward the work, whether it's on local maternity neonatal systems, publishing equity and equality action plans. I'm sure the members read her own for her own local area, whether it's the MNC introducing standards where midwives are expected to have cultural competency, whether it's the NHS England introducing diverse workforce with getting to equity programmes to ensure that inspiring ethnic minority midwives are promoted, or whether it's the maternal medicines networks targeting black mothers in particular to improve their overall health during pregnancy. There is significant work being done in this area.
It's really disturbing that there are these serious disparities in maternal health outcomes for black women. So will the Minister really reassure us that the government is looking at the causes of this? Because until we are clear on what's causing it, we're not going to solve this problem.
Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend is exactly right, and that is why the task force is focusing on preconception care, because before a woman gets pregnant, many of the disparities have been there for years before, and that is why we're working with stakeholders in this space to see how we can improve access to preconception care, which will make a huge difference to the outcomes of pregnancy and birth.
Show them before.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As chair of the All-Party Group on Baby Loss, I've heard evidence of how one of the ways we can get around this or help women in this situation is by having continuity of carer. It helps with exposing lifestyle choices and other experiences such as domestic violence that might happen with people who are from an ethnic diverse background or socially deprived background. Can the Minister let me know what the Department is doing to help expand a continuity of carer for people that need it?
Minister.
Well, absolutely, I can reassure my honourable friend, because we're spending £7 million to ensure that 75% of black, Asian and minority ethnic women are being cared for by the same midwife during their pregnancy, because we do know that continuity of carer improves outcomes for those women.
We now come to Shadow Secretary Annalise Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My understanding is that the black maternal mortality gap is actually 3.7 times more likely. The Asian maternal mortality gap is twice as likely than white women. We also find now that women in deprived areas are 2.5 times more likely to die than those from the least deprived areas. And scandalously, even before the pandemic hit, maternal mortalities increased by 12% in the previous 6 years of Tory government. Now, as the Minister said, the Maternal Disparities Task Force was supposed to be tackling this. Can I ask, how many months elapsed between its last 2 meetings?
Minister.
Well, absolutely, we recognise the disparities have existed for decades, and we are the first government ever to recognise that and to set up the Maternity Disparities Task Force to tackle those problems. We actually met on the 18th of April, and we've set about introducing the toolkit that will be looking at preconception care, because as we know that many of these women face disparities long before they get pregnant, long before they give birth, and it's by tackling those preconception disparities that we will improve outcomes for those women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister didn't answer my question, I think because she knows the answer. The task force didn't meet for 9 months. Then it was suddenly convened the day after a damning report had been published. No government serious about this would allow enough time for a baby to be carried to term to elapse between meetings, nor would it scrap continuity of carer targets not mentioned by the Minister, or omit serious action against maternity disparities from its women's health strategy. Labour would restore maternity services, training 10,000 midwives and nurses a year, paid for by scrapping the non-dom tax exemption. So why is the government letting women pay the price for its failures? Why?
Minister.
Well, this government doesn't need to have a meeting to take action. We are working night and day to drive these disparities down. £165 million going into funding maternity services overall. There's £95 million to pay for 1,200 more midwives and another 100 consultant obstetricians. She will, I'm sure, has read page to page the 3-year maternity plan. She says she has, I hope she has, on driving down inequalities in both maternal and neonatal care. And it'd be great if we could have cross-party support for this groundbreaking work.
We come to Topical's vital fabric.
Question 1, sir.
Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, we published a report on the substantial progress we have made in delivering our groundbreaking Inclusive Britain Action Plan to tackle unfair ethnic disparities. Just 1 year after we launched the action plan, we fulfilled 32 of the 74 commitments, including issuing voluntary guidance for employers on how to measure and address ethnicity pay gaps, and I will report back to Parliament in 12 months' time on the progress we've made in delivering the remaining actions in building a stronger, fairer, more united society.
Michael Fabricant.
I thank my right honourable friend for her answer. Mr. Speaker, while I fully understand the need for protected places for women, and I totally support this, and also issues when it comes to sports, I'm growing increasingly concerned that trans people are becoming demonised in some quarters. What is the Secretary of State doing to protect the interests and protect the very nature of genuine trans people?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I want to emphasise that the government believes in the principle of individual liberty and in the humanity and dignity of every person. And in everything we do, we want to make sure that we take the toxicity out of the debate. A lot of the demonisation is happening out there on social media. We have a responsibility to make sure that all trans people have that dignity and are looked after. In terms of what other things we're doing, NHS England is working to expand clinical capacity in adult gender identity services by establishing new pilot clinics rooted in primary care and sexual health services, and 4 of those new clinics have opened since 2020, with the 5th opening this year, and they will be able to provide a lot of the health care that the trans people need.
Chris Stevens.
From the Living Wage Foundation shows that over 2 million women in the UK earn below the real living wage and are also more likely to be trapped in low-pay, insecure and precarious jobs. So will the Minister work with Cabinet colleagues to ensure that work actually pays by introducing a real living wage and strengthening protection for workers on zero-hour contracts?
I thank the honourable gentleman for raising this issue in terms of women being able to progress and do well in work, which is why at the DWP we have a focus on in-work progression, giving particularly women who perhaps had childcare or other needs or training needs the support they need to progress and thrive in work.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Mr. Speaker, we know that between 500,000 and 1 million people in the UK are using steroids, particularly to improve their body image. Now, some studies show that this is even more prolific in the gay community, with up to 6 times more than their straight counterparts. So will the department commission and work with DCMS and Health to look into a study of anabolic use in the UK?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I commend my honourable friend for the extensive work that he's done in this important area. I think I absolutely agree with his analysis, and of course, as both a DCMS Minister and the Minister for Equalities, I can assure him that I will be taking a very keen interest in this area of work.
Kenny McCaskill.
Mr. Speaker, welcome changes have been made by MOJ on transgender prisoners, excluding not just sexual but violent transgender prisoners from the general women's estate, and also those still physically male, but also accessing vulnerability for females on the basis of sex at birth. Does the Minister accept the need, not just in justice institutions but across other departments, for both single-sex spaces and services, but also for the acceptance of sex at birth as being the criteria?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, of course, safety must come first. And while it is true that over 90% of transgender women are in the male estate, I think it is right that we have further strengthened our policy as far as those committed of sexual violent offences are concerned, all those who retain birth genitalia, who can only be housed elsewhere in truly exceptional circumstances reviewed on a case-by-case basis.
We now come to questions to Prime Minister Tim Lawton. One, sir. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the UK will continue to work to end the bloodshed in Sudan and support a democratic government. We have begun a large-scale evacuation of British nationals, and I pay tribute to all those carrying out this complex operation. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the opposition grabbed a crude headline about teaching boys to have respect for women, an important issue I'm sure the Prime Minister will agree. But given that the Leader of the Opposition apparently doesn't know what a woman is, that he won't stand up to defend women in his own party, voicing views on women's rights, and according to his own front bench, failed to prosecute rapists when he was in charge as DPP, does my right honourable friend think that the Labour Party are in any position to teach anyone about respect for women? And is the irony dead?
I'm going to bring the place in, but in fairness, these are responsibility for the answer for the opposition, but Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. The leader of the opposition's record on women is questionable at best, Mr. Speaker. And before Labour do start preaching about this issue, they should work out the answer to one very simple question. I'm certain what a woman is he?
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, can I join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to the brave British personnel involved in the evacuation effort from Sudan? The government must do everything in its power to urgently evacuate UK nationals still trapped in Sudan. Mr. Speaker, yesterday George Osborne said that the Tory party's handling of the economy makes them vandals. He's right, isn't he?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, while we're in the business of quoting former chancellors and shadow chancellors, I don't know if he saw the remarks from a former Labour shadow chancellor yesterday, who said our country had faced 4 once-in-a-century shocks, threats to our economy, and the fact that we've come through it is a triumph, Mr. Speaker.
Well, that former Chancellor not only said there were a bunch of Tory vandals, he also said there was a self-induced financial crisis on the country. That's those vandals. And they like to pretend that it was all just 1 week of madness last autumn. But the truth is, it's been 13 years of failure. Real wages, the money in people's pockets, have fallen by £1,600 per household. £1,600. The Prime Minister's response? To impose 24 Tory tax rises in 3 years. 24. How on earth does he think his low-growth, high-tax economy is working for working people?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, because of the action that we've taken on the national living wage at record levels, on pension, on universal credit, and the generous cost of living payments, just yesterday, Mr. Speaker, almost 8 million households receiving direct support from this Conservative government. We are supporting working people. But just this week, Mr. Speaker, in the other place, we've seen his party side with protesters and with picketers. He should actually try backing working people.
Lost £1,600 worse off. Mr. Speaker, I'm genuinely fascinated to know, does he really think that everything's fine, or is he just clueless about life outside of his bubble?
Mr. Speaker, because of the actions that we have taken, well, let's just go over it. A single mother working full-time on the national living wage this year will get £1,300 more support from this government. A working couple on low income with 2 children will get £1,800, Mr. Speaker. That's what delivering for working Britain looks like. But if he has any actual ideas for the economy, he should say so, because all I hear from the party opposite, it's more spending, more borrowing, higher inflation, higher interest rates. It's the same old Labour Party.
This is Mr. 24 tax rises. And I've never heard anything so out of touch as the answer that he has just given. And it's not just his refusal to take any responsibility for the damage they've done, the crashed economy, the hit to living standards. It's also he refuses to take the action that's needed. He could stop the handouts he's giving to oil and gas giants. He could scrap his beloved non-dom status. He could put that money back in the hands of working people and get the NHS back on its feet. That's what a Labour government would do. Why doesn't he?
Mr. Speaker, the record was clear. Look at it right now. Record numbers of people in work, Mr. Speaker. Record numbers of people in work. Inequality lower. The number of people in poverty lower. Those in low pay, the lowest numbers on record, Mr. Speaker. He talks about this non-dom thing. I think he's already spent the money that he claims he'd raised on 5 different things, Mr. Speaker, because it's the same old Labour Party. They're always running out of other people's money.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. I had enough last week. I'm certainly not having this continuous noise. So just be aware that somebody will be going for that cup of tea today. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he calls it this non-dom thing. Let's be honest about what his refusal to scrap the non-dom status means. It means that at every possible opportunity he has voted to put taxes up on working people, while at the same time taking every possible opportunity to protect a tax avoidance scheme that helped his own finances. Why is the Prime Minister telling people across the country that their taxes must go up so that his can stay low?
Mr. Speaker, the facts are these. The very wealthiest pay more tax and the poorest pay less tax today than under any year of the last Labour government, Mr. Speaker. We've also boosted the national living wage, boosted universal credit and pensioners. But, Mr. Speaker, the rank hypocrisy of it, as we saw last week, when it comes to his own special pension scheme. I said it last week, but I'll say it again. It's literally one law for him and a tax rise for everybody else.
Mr. Speaker, here's the difference. I'd scrap his pension giveaway, whether it affected me or not. He refuses to scrap the non-dom status that benefits him and his family. I can see why he's attracted to this non-dom thing. This Prime Minister is so removed from the country that he boasted that he didn't know a single working-class person. So insulated from reality that he proudly told a Tory garden party how he'd moved money from poorer areas and handed it to rich ones. So out of touch that he looks at a petrol pump and a debit card like they've just arrived from Mars. Is it any wonder that he smiles his way through the cost of living crisis while putting other people's taxes up? Is it any wonder he doesn't have a clue how food prices are hammering families across the country? And is it any wonder that under him people are paying more and more and getting less and less?
Mr. Speaker, we'll just look at what's happened just in this week, Mr. Speaker, where the Labour Party have put themselves. On Monday, in the other place, they decided to side with extremist protesters. Just yesterday, they sided with polluters, Mr. Speaker. And tonight we will see them siding with the people smugglers, Mr. Speaker. I tell you this, whilst we're in the business of sending back the 1,000th illegal migrant from Albania, Mr. Speaker. We're delivering cost of living payments to millions of households just yesterday, and today we've announced we put 20,000 more police officers on the street, Mr. Speaker. We're siding with the British people, Mr. Speaker. That's what the Conservative government does.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 60 years ago, Goulburn Urban District Council wrote to the government about the urgent need for a bypass for my constituency of Lee. 40 years ago, the central section of that bypass, the Atherley Way, was constructed. But to this day, the bypass remains unfinished, leading to daily gridlock in some areas of the community. Will the Prime Minister support my proposals to complete the Atherley Way, and will he meet with me to discuss this further so we can get Lee moving again?
Mr. Speaker, I commend my honourable friends campaigning on this issue, and I know there have been a number of proposals for road improvements in his area. He will know that it's for the local highways authority to develop those plans, but I know a meeting is planned in June to move proposals forward, and I know he will take his energy and enthusiasm for his campaign to that meeting, and I wish him well.
We come to SNP spokesperson Stephen Clinton. Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Prime Minister to outline the safe and legal route available to a child refugee seeking to flee Sudan and come to the United Kingdom?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I outlined earlier, our priority in Sudan, first and foremost, was to evacuate our diplomats and their families, which I'm very pleased. We were one of the first countries to be able to do, Mr. Speaker. And since yesterday, we've been conducting a large-scale evacuation of British nationals. We have some of the largest numbers of British nationals on the ground, and rightly, and I'm sure the whole House will agree with me, that it is reasonable, legal and fair to prioritise those most vulnerable families, particularly those with elderly people in them, medical conditions, but also children, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're in the process of doing, and I pay tribute to all those who are making it possible.
Leader of the SNP.
Mr. Speaker, to be clear, and I think everyone in the House is aware of this, children in Sudan are already dying. Now, whether it's a Tory slogan to stop the boats or a Labour slogan to stop small boats, we need some more humanity in this debate, rather than the race to the bottom which we see here today. So can I ask the Prime Minister, now that he has confirmed that there is no safe and legal route, will he therefore confirm that it would be his government's intention to detain and deport a child refugee who flees Sudan and comes to the United Kingdom?
Mr. Speaker, in fact, because of the efforts of our aid teams, we've invested almost £250 million in humanitarian support in Sudan over the past 5 years. And Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman does it always, but actually this country has a proud record of compassionately supporting those who need our assistance. Just over the last few years, we have welcomed almost 500,000 vulnerable people to our country, including many children, and it's that compassion that we want to make sure we continue, Mr. Speaker, which is why it's precisely right that we make sure that our system is not exploited by those coming here illegally, and that's what our bill will deliver.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Mr. Speaker, the Lib Dem-run Hinckley and Bosworth Borough Council don't have an up-to-date local plan. So that every day that goes past, we have speculative housing applications that put pressure on the infrastructure like GP surgery, schools and roads. Now, locally, the Lib Dems say it's the 300,000 housing target the government has, yet the Lib Dems have a target of 380,000 houses now. So will the Prime Minister change the law to ensure that communities like Burbage, Barwell, Markfield and Market Bosworth get the infrastructure and protection they need for the houses that we need?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to point out the hypocrisy of the local Liberal Democrats on this issue. And he's right to highlight this issue locally, because the new infrastructure levy does give local areas the power to deliver the local infrastructure that he supports and wants for his area. But also, he's absolutely right to point out the importance of a local plan, because it is precisely that having a local plan is what gives communities the power to ensure that development in their area is happening in the way that they want it to, and the council is failing in its duty to do that for its communities by not putting forward that local plan.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Well, incredibly, any traveller wanting to go by train from North to South Wales has to go via England. Linking Wales north to south would cost £2 billion. Now, the PM talks about running away with other people's money, but his government is depriving Wales to the tune of £6 billion by ruling that north-south England rail links like HS2 somehow benefit Wales. Will he plead guilty to the Great Welsh Train Robbery?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable lady knows how transport matters are handled in Wales, and what I would say to her is that we do always want to work cooperatively with the Welsh Government, see where we can deliver jointly for people in Wales. We're actually investing record sums in communities up and down Wales through the Levelling Up Fund and the Community Ownership Fund. We're happy to continue those conversations. Many of those are transportation projects, and I think hopefully she'll join me in saying what the people of Wales do not need is the Labour Welsh Government's plan to ban all building of new roads.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister back our local plans to reopen our much-loved Malvern Hills College? And does he agree that Warwickshire College Group should negotiate the sale in good faith and not resort to using public money to sue our district council?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising this issue. I, of course, recognise the valuable work that all colleges do in meeting local skills need, and very much welcome local community groups working together to address gaps in the way that her local area is doing. My understanding is that my honourable friend, the Education Secretary, is in discussion with the college, and I know that my honourable friend will continue making representations to her.
Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Ian Greenwood, tragically lost his 12-year-old daughter in a road traffic collision that should never have happened. Ian's now campaigning for Leeds Vision Zero, which aims to end road deaths and serious injuries by 2040. We really have to make our roads much safer. So will the Prime Minister commit to giving local authorities sufficient funding in order to ensure that these vehicle collisions can never take a young life again?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm incredibly sorry to hear about the tragic loss of Ian's daughter. Of course, we should do everything we can to improve road safety. I know actually at the moment that we are doing an enormous amount and the statistics show that it's improving, but we're always happy to look at where we can do more, and I know the Transport Secretary will look into the suggestions raised by the honourable gentleman.
Roberts.
Mr. Speaker, the village of Northup Hall in my constituency has about 1,000 residents. Last year, Northup Hall Hotel on the edge of the village was bought, and there are now proposals to house 400 single male migrants in the building and in shipping containers stacked around the grounds. The village has one small shop, no transport links, and a health board in complete meltdown. Can the Prime Minister facilitate a meeting for myself and some local residents with the Home Secretary to hear the concerns of the local residents who are worried that the government just isn't listening to them?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman raises exactly why we need to take action, because it's not right that our local hotels in all our communities are being used to such a degree to house illegal asylum seekers, not least because it's costing the British taxpayer something like £5.5 or £6 million a day. We want to put an end to that, and that's why we're bringing forward legislation that will enable us to swiftly detain and send back those who should not be here, but I will make sure that he gets a meeting with the Immigration Minister as he needs.
Kerry McCarthy.
Trussell Trust figures out today show that their food banks gave out a record number of meals over the past year. It's nearly 3 million meals, 1 million of which went to children. Now, the Prime Minister's fortunate, he's a wealthy man, but all these families want to be able to do is to put food on their table, to be able to feed their own children without having to resort to food banks. Does he think that's too much to ask?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said previously, we absolutely do want anyone to have to rely on a food bank, but whilst there are people who do use them, I'm very grateful to all of those who volunteer their time to make sure that they are providing their local communities. We've put substantial provision in place, not least infant free school meals and broader free school meals, which are helping almost 2 million children, but also last year the investment in the Holiday Activity and Food Programme, which provides not just food but also activities outside of term time, and we'll continue to do everything we can to help those in low pay, which is why we're raising the national living wage to record levels, and I'm pleased to say that those living in poverty today is 2 million lower than when we first came into office.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, e-cigarettes were introduced as a stop smoking device, but they're remarkably cheap, brightly coloured, vapes with flavours such as unicorn milkshake, bubblegum and green gummy bear have proved remarkably attractive to children, hooking them on a lifetime of potentially harmful nicotine addiction. Will my honourable friend meet with me to talk about how work across government departments can help to stop our children becoming hooked on vapes? And will he back my 10-minute rule bill to ban disposable vapes?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Can I commend my honourable friend for her work in this area? I absolutely recognise the concern that she raises, both on the environmental impact of disposable vapes, but also their appeal to children. DHSE have announced a call for evidence to look at reducing youth vaping, including vape appearance, flavours and marketing. We've also been clear that all electrical waste should be disposed of properly, and DEFRA are looking actively at what changes in legislation might be needed to ensure that the vaping sector foots the bill for the collection and treatment of their used products.
Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we celebrate the lives of Lily Savage and Dame Edna Everidge, Turning Point UK are planning to protest at a drag storytime event in my constituency on Saturday for the 3rd time this year. These events are friendly, inclusive opportunities for children to hear a story and learn about equality. Turning Point UK members, by contrast, seek to intimidate our young people. They share misleading images on social media, implying the events are inappropriate. So will the Prime Minister condemn Turning Point UK's attempts to spread hatred and division in my constituency and across the country?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware of the specific allegations the Honourable Lady brings to light, but in general, we should treat everybody with respect and understanding and compassion, Mr. Speaker, and people should be allowed to gather and associate freely within the bounds of the law and ensued. But when it comes to children, as we've said, it's important that the material that children are exposed to in classrooms is sensitive and age appropriate, and that's why we're reviewing the RHSE guidance currently.
James Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This year marks the 400th anniversary of the publication of Shakespeare's first folio, and his plays are not only a central part of our national culture, but many people around the world see them as a beacon of hope in darkest times. I recently met with Professor Natalia Tokrut, the director of the Shakespeare Institute in Ukraine, who told stories of actors, directors and scholars putting on Shakespeare plays in air raid shelters in Ukraine as an act of defiance against Russian aggression and bombs. So would the Prime Minister agree with me that, notwithstanding the sound and fury of domestic politics, that in Shakespeare's works we have a force for freedom in a world often dominated by the brutality and tyranny of oppressive regimes?
Can I join my honourable friend in his comments? And coincidentally, one of the first gifts that I gave President Zelensky was an old copy of Henry V. And so I think his comments are well made. And that's why we're training and arming the Ukrainian forces with the equipment they need to push back Russian forces. And we know, and I know the whole House will join me in saying, that the people of Ukraine's incredible strength and inspiring bravery will ultimately defeat tyranny.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This month marks 23 years since the passing of the late, great Bernie Grant, a former member of this House and the founder of the UK reparations movement in the UK. In his last Prime Minister's questions before his death, he asked for an apology to the people of African descent, living and dead, for our country's role in slavery and colonialism. But since then, Prime Ministers and heads of state have only ever expressed sorrow or deep regret. These are not sentiments that are befitting one of the greatest atrocities in human history. And there's been no acknowledgement of the wealth that has been amassed or the fact that our country took out the largest loan it ever has to pay off the slave owners and not the enslaved. So I want to ask the Prime Minister today if he will do what Bernie Grant asked all those years ago, what I have asked and what countless others have asked since, and offer a full and meaningful apology for our country's role in slavery and colonialism and commit to reparatory justice.
Well, no, Mr. Speaker. What I think our focus focus should now be on doing is, of course, understanding our history in all its parts, not running away from it, but right now making sure that we have a society which is inclusive and tolerant of people from all backgrounds. That's something that we on this House, our side of the House, are committed to doing and will continue to deliver, but trying to unpick our history is not the right way forward and is not something that we will focus our energies on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will recall his visit to Rugby to see our great work in delivering new homes and the new community of Holton, where 1,000 of 6,000 homes are now occupied. But regrettably, urgent care services at our local hospital of St Cross are not keeping pace with this growth. And as a consequence, 80,000 of my constituents now live more than 50 minutes drive from a major A&E unit. May I therefore invite the Prime Minister to return to Rugby to see for himself the need to upgrade our emergency care provision.
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely vital that people can access the NHS services they need, particularly emergency care, and that's why we're investing an extra £1 billion, a dedicated funding to support urgent emergency care services. My honourable friend will know that the specific provision is a matter for local NHS commissioners and providers, because plans for those things need to be developed locally and take into account the expanding needs of local populations. And I know that my honourable friend will continue to engage with his local NHS trust to ensure the views of his constituents and communities are well known and adequately provided for.
Angela Crawley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, every day I meet with constituents struggling to make ends meet, food banks barely managing to meet the demands, households and businesses up and down this country struggling to meet their energy bills. Yet the Bank of England has already announced that it is likely to increase interest rates once again, which will affect the poorest most and hike up mortgage rates once again. Does the Prime Minister, after 13 years of Conservatives government, agree with the Bank of England's chief economist that the poorest should just accept being poorer?
Mr. Speaker, we're doing an enormous amount to support those who most need our help with the cost of living and some of the pressures, particularly on energy bills, that they face. That's why we made a decision to tax the windfall profits of energy companies and use that money to help pay around half of a typical family's energy bill. That is support worth £1,500. It applies across the United Kingdom. And on top of that, there are direct payments going to the most vulnerable families in our society. Just yesterday, the first of those payments was put out, £300, the first of 3 payments, and that went to 1 in 3 households, Mr. Speaker, including many in Scotland. And that is our Conservative government delivering for the people of Scotland and making sure they have the help they need to manage some of the pressures that they're facing.
Sir Robert Goodwin.
In Yorkshire, we say you should judge a person by the company that they keep. So what would be the Prime Minister's view of an individual who can not only bear to spend more than 10 minutes in the presence of Vladimir Putin, but refers to him as a dear friend?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think our views on President Putin are well known. His illegal war in Ukraine has caused untold misery for many people. It's caused a humanitarian crisis and is still ongoing in defiance of international condemnation and sanction. Mr. Speaker, we will do everything we can to bring those responsible for war crimes to justice, continue to support Ukraine militarily, and make sure that we can support them all the way to victory, Mr. Speaker. And I know that the whole House is united in wanting that outcome.
Sir George Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the chronic lack of capacity in the NHS, the Prime Minister will be aware that community pharmacies can help deal with minor illnesses. But there is a problem. On average, 10 pharmacies close every month in England. Will he take urgent action to prevent further closures and commission a properly funded Pharmacy First service for minor illnesses?
Mr. Speaker, it's a rare agreement between the honourable gentleman and myself that I'm a wholehearted champion and believer in the role that community pharmacists can play, and we want to make sure that they can do everything to ease some of the pressures in primary care. It's something that we're actively talking to the sector about. We'll always continue to do everything we can to support community pharmacies. I know firsthand how respected they are in their communities, and I think they can do more for us over time.
Sarah Atherton.
after a 15-year break, Wrexham Association Football Club is back in the English football. Will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating everyone at the club, including the loyal supporters and the owners, Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney? And does he agree that Wrexham is no longer a neglected place, but quickly becoming a jewel in the crown of the United Kingdom?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I join my honourable friend in congratulating everyone at Wrexham, from the owners to the players to supporters and everyone in the community. It's been an incredible ride. We've all enjoyed watching them, and we wish them every future success, Mr. Speaker. And I join with her in saying they are indeed a jewel in the crown, and she deserves enormous credit for championing them in this place.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After an investigation ordered by the Prime Minister himself, a senior Conservative MP was found guilty of bullying, found guilty of behaviour that was persistently aggressive and intimidating. The MP in question then attempted to blame his victims, and a whole string of Conservative MPs queued up to defend him, suggesting that his conduct was not only acceptable but was actually good management practice. What does it say about the Prime Minister's own values that he has done nothing to distance himself from those comments?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when formal complaints were made, I rightly initiated an independent investigation, and as soon as it reported, action was taken. That's the right thing to do, to follow due process and then let the process play out, Mr. Speaker. But I do think it is somewhat odd to be getting lectures on values right now from the SNP.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Those please leave.